from women that are promiscuous in nature. He says, "For the lips of a strange woman drop as an honeycomb, and her mouth is smoother than oil, but her end is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword." And there is a detailed discussion in these verses by Solomon, speaking, of course, by inspiration of God, against the dangers and destruction of men doing this, and, of course, their souls being destroyed. He basically concludes this discussion by saying, "Rejoice with the wife of thy youth." In other words, be faithful to your wife, the wife of your youth, and don't be running around after strange women. That's the emphasis of this chapter. And if you do, then certain destruction lies in wait for you. So Solomon is giving some really good advice by inspiration that's certainly the truth and that every man needs to listen to. What's sad about this is that as Solomon grew older, he lost sight of the seriousness of this matter. And in 1 Kings chapter 11, and I'd like to ask you to turn to the first 4 verses here in 1 Kings chapter 11. And I want us to spend just a few moments noticing what happened to Solomon and the lack of wisdom. He was actually very, very foolish instead of wise by going after strange women that turned his heart away from God. Listen carefully. But King Solomon loved many strange women, together with the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Zidonians, and Hittites, of the nations concerning which the Lord said unto the children of Israel, Ye shall not go into them, neither shall they come in unto you. For surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. And the next phrase says that Solomon clave unto these in love. And he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. Look at this phrase. And his wives turned away his heart. For it came to pass when Solomon was old, that his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. And so here is an instance where Solomon had his head on right in the beginning of his life, but he went after strange women just like he was warning against in Proverbs chapter 5 and in other places in the book of Proverbs. He talks about this quite a bit. Have you ever wondered what were concubines? You know, this passage says that he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. And his wives turned away his heart. Let me read you just a little bit about concubines or a concubine. In the Bible, a concubine is a woman who lives with a man as if she were a wife, but without having the same status as a wife. Concubines in the patriarchal age and beyond held an inferior rank. They were secondary wives. A concubine could not marry her master because of her slave status, although for her the relationship was exclusive and ongoing. Early on, it seems that concubines were used to bear children for men whose wives were barren. See Genesis 16, 1 through 4. Later, it seems that concubines were kept simply for sexual pleasure. 2 Chronicles 11:21. Concubines in Israel possessed some of the same rights as legitimate wives without the same respect. Although it's true the Bible nowhere explicitly condemns concubines, a condemnation can be found implicitly from the beginning of time. According to Genesis 2:21 through 24, God's original intent was for marriage to be between one man and one woman, and that has never changed. Genesis 1:27. As a matter of fact, a study of the lives of men like King David and King Solomon, who had 300 concubines, 1 Kings 11 and 3, reveals that many of their problems stemmed from polygamous relationships. 2 Samuel 11, 2 through 4. The Bible never explains why God allowed men to have concubines. He allowed divorce and polygamy too, although neither was part of his original plan for marriage. Jesus said God allowed divorce because of the hardness of men's hearts. Matthew 19 and verse 8. We can assume the same hardness of heart led to polygamy and the use of concubines. And of course, when Jesus came along and gave his gospel, he made corrections in all of those areas. Divorce, polygamy, and of course the same applied to concubines. And so he corrected those matters in the gospel and told us in Matthew 19:9 that was not God's original plan. One man, one woman for life, and fornication being the only scriptural grounds for divorce. Matthew 19 and verse 9. And so this is tragic, what happened to Solomon. He gives some very serious and important information about men going after strange women in Proverbs chapter 5. But he was a man of free choice. He could choose his life, and he did that, and he made many unwise decisions later on in his life. And sometimes when people become rich, become famous, and Solomon was unbelievably rich and unbelievably famous, then they kindly developed the attitude, well, whatever I want, I can get. And with Solomon, this included strange women, even heathen women that worshipped other gods. And as we notice from 1 Kings 11, they turned his heart away from God, and he became an idolater. Hard to believe, but that happened to King Solomon. And so when you're in a position, and none of us will ever be in that position, where he could say, whatsoever mine eyes desired, I kept not from them. That's in Ecclesiastes 2. Whatsoever mine eyes desired, I kept not from them. Well, see, that included wrong things too. And that included strange women. So if he wanted a wife, he took her. If he wanted a concubine, he got her. Anything he wanted, he could have. And in reality, that's not a good position to be in. Because when we're in a position like that, or a person is, then it's very hard to control what you want. And it's very hard not to choose some things that will destroy your life. So that's exactly what happened to Solomon. And the advice he gives by inspiration in Proverbs 5 is some wonderful, wonderful advice that every man needs to pay close attention to. And so what I want to do is just pick up again with verse 3 and basically read the rest of this chapter, because that's the gist of it, with the emphasis on rejoicing with the wife of thy youth. In other words, being a faithful husband to your wife that you have chosen in life. I do want to stop at a point or two, or at a verse or two, and emphasize a point or two because of some very important things that are said in those verses. But let's continue with verse 3 and read. For the lips of a strange woman drop as a honeycomb, and her mouth is smoother than oil. But her end is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death, her steps take hold on hell, on Sheol. Lest thou shouldest ponder the path of life, her ways are movable, that thou canst not know them. Hear me now, therefore, O you children, and depart not from the words of my mouth. Remove thy way far from her, and come not nigh the door of her house, lest thou give thine honor unto others, and thy years unto the cruel. Lest strangers be filled with thy wealth, and thy labors be in the house of a stranger. And thou mourn at the last, when thy flesh and thy body are consumed. And say, how have I hated instruction, and my heart despised reproof. Now, look at this attitude that will make you mourn at the end of your life. And we don't want to mourn at the end of our lives, do we? We want to rejoice looking forward to heaven. That's our purpose. But see, this attitude of hating instruction and despising reproof will cause us to mourn at the end of our lives. And look at 13. And have not obeyed the voice of my teachers, nor inclined mine ear to them that instructed me. If you don't do this, you're going to regret it. If you have this attitude, it's going to cause you to mourn in your old age. If you hate instruction, if you don't want to be taught, you even despise someone trying to tell you what's right. You despise reproof. You don't obey the voice of your teachers. And you don't incline your ear to them that instruct you. Well, you know, in essence, when we think about it from the Bible, those that were inspired of God are our teachers. Whether we're talking about Solomon in the book of Proverbs, whether we're talking about Paul or Peter or John or whoever. And so our responsibility is to recognize this, first of all, as being the Word of God and Him being the master teacher, the greatest teacher of all, and us being sure that we love instruction, we want to be taught, that we recognize that we need to be reproved, and that it's for our best, and that we need to obey these teachers of God. And we need to really love instruction because it betters our lives and also it keeps us out of trouble. And somehow the old devil is able to deceive us to the degree that we think trouble's not going to come. When the prodigal son left home, do you think he thought trouble was going to come? Not at all, did he? He thought he was going to have the greatest life in the world. And even though it's just described as being riotous living, which that's a broad term, but don't you know, insinuated in that is that he ran around after strange women in his riotous life. And notice what happened to him. That's really an example of what Proverbs chapter 5 is talking about. And so that's the reason our attitude about wanting to be taught and being teachable people, not resenting instruction, is so important. Because that's what we need. And the difference is, at the end of our lives, I mean, there's a lot of differences, but the difference he's emphasizing here is at the end of our lives, it's the difference between mourning or happiness. Looking forward to something like heaven, or dreading the terrors of hell. That's what you're talking about. And so this is an extremely, extremely important matter. And we need to take heed to it. And so, how have I hated instruction, and my heart despised reproof? And have not obeyed the voice of my teachers, nor inclined mine ear to them that instructed me. I was on the verge of total ruin in the midst of the congregation and assembly. Drink waters out of thine own cistern, and running waters out of thine own well. He's using figurative language here to talk about you being faithful to your own. Let thy fountains be dispersed abroad, and rivers of waters in the streets. Let them be only thine own, and not strangers with thee. Let thy fountain be blessed. And I love this statement. And rejoice with the wife of thy youth. That is a beautiful statement, isn't it? Rejoice with the wife of thy youth. As long as you live, you are not only faithful to her, but you rejoice with the wife of your youth, and you cultivate that relationship as the years go by. And he uses some language here that we might not be used to seeing in the Bible, but the point is well taken. In verse 19, let her be as the loving hind and pleasant roe, Let her breast satisfy thee at all times. See, not another woman. You're not out here running around after another woman. But you let the wife of your youth satisfy you at all times. Let her breast satisfy thee at all times, and be thou ravished. Notice this. And be thou ravished always with her love. Well, see, in those statements, we see what a husband and wife relationship is supposed to be like. It's something that's very, very beautiful. It's according to God's plan. It's according to His instruction. He created man and woman, and we see the first home in Genesis chapter 2. And they were to become one flesh. And they were to be ravished with one another's love as long as they lived. And so on that basis, he asks in verse 20, and why wilt thou, my son, be ravished with a strange woman, and embrace the bosom of a stranger? For the ways of man are before the eyes of the Lord, and he pondereth all his goings. This is another fact that the majority of people forget about. Sorry, Marinelle, I didn't hear that. Yes, okay. Seductive? Oh, okay, good. But what you see in verse 21, and something that we must always realize, that the eyes of the Lord are in every place, beholding the evil and the good. For the ways of man are before the eyes of the Lord. And so, you're not going to escape the presence of God, even though you may want to. And He sees every person all the time. And He knows everything about that person all the time. That verse is Proverbs 15 and verse 3. The eyes of the Lord are in every place, beholding the evil and the good. But now notice, He doesn't just behold the evil. He also beholds the good. And there is reward for the good, right? And sometimes we overlook this fact. We think, well, God's just looking at me and seeing every wrong thing that I do. God is looking at you and seeing every good thing that you do. And if you're trying not to do wrong, God knows that and God appreciates that. And we need to understand that. But sometimes we have a warped view of God, thinking that, well, He just emphasizes the evil or concentrates on the evil. No. He does behold the evil, but He also beholds the good. And the emphasis is He blesses those that does good, and He punishes those that do evil. And really that's the same thing that's being said here in verse 21 as we've just read in 15 and verse 3. The ways of man are before the eyes of the Lord, and He pondereth all His goings. maybe one of the best examples that you cannot escape the presence of God is in the story of Jonah. Jonah was told to go preach against Nineveh. He thought he could run away from God. So he gets in a ship and he takes off. Well, we all know God's everywhere. God sees everything. And you cannot run away from God. So when Jonah tried to do that, and how foolish that is, then God taught him a very serious lesson. And we've talked about in our class on Wednesday night about God disciplining us through His providential care. We had a great study Wednesday night on the providence of God. But one way that God acts through natural means in our lives is that He chastens us. He disciplines us. He does it through His providential care, through natural means and natural things. But we know that that discipline is for our good. But I think we would all agree that we don't want God to discipline us like He did Jonah. That was really a disciplined story. To be cast out of that ship and to be swallowed by that great fish and be alive in the belly of that great fish. And there's one thing he did do that certainly all of us would be doing. We'd be praying, wouldn't we? We were in the belly of a great fish in the ocean, we'd be praying. So, isn't it interesting, though, when you think about Jonah and this story and these verses on the presence of God? Jonah thought when he got on that ship that he was running away from God's presence. But when he got in the belly of that great fish, he was hoping he was still in God's presence, wasn't he? Because he started praying to God. And that's a wonderful example that says, even though you might be in the belly of a great fish, you're still in the presence of God, and He can hear your prayer. So, Jonah basically was saying, Lord, if you'll just get me out of here, I promise I'll do what you say. And that's what he did. Even though it did make him mad when the people of Nineveh repented of their sins. But what a great story about the presence of God. You're on a ship, you're in the presence of God. If you're in the belly of a whale, you are in the presence of God. And most people live not only as if they're not in the presence of God, but really as if God doesn't even exist. And there's no such thing as a judgment or a reckoning day. But this chapter, in different ways, makes it plain that if you live the wrong kind of life, there's going to be mourning at the end of your life. And there's not going to be rejoicing. And so you also tie that in. Hell is a place of what? What did Jesus say? Where there shall be, remember that phrase? Weeping and what? Gnashing of teeth, right? Well, there's that mourning. Where there shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. But the other side, nothing but rejoicing. Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven. And so, at the end, you're going to find that rejoicing. That's what we're all doing. That's why we're here today. We love the Lord. We're doing our best to please Him. He's pleased with us because of that. And so there's going to be great rejoicing. 22, his own iniquities shall take the wicked himself. Throughout the Bible, it's taught that you reap what you sow. Sooner or later, you reap what you sow. His own iniquities shall take the wicked himself, and he shall be holden or held with the cords of his sins. He shall die without instruction. Think about that. That's so tragic. He shall die without instruction, and in the greatness of his folly he shall go. So, some pretty strong advice that Solomon is giving. And unfortunately, later in his life, he didn't pay attention to this advice that he gave. All right, let's begin chapter 6. We have just a few moments. My son, if thou be surety for thy friend. What does that mean, surety? It means you are a guarantor. Somebody who pledges that another's obligations will be met in case of default. So you are pledging a very serious obligation if you are one of surety for thy friend. If he defaults, you're saying you'll pay it. You'll take care of that obligation. It's like signing a note with another person. So my son, if thou be surety for thy friend, if thou hast strengthened thy hand with a stranger, thou art snared with the words of thy mouth, thou art taken with the words of thy mouth. Do this now, my son, and deliver thyself when thou art come into the hand of thy friend. Go humble thyself and make sure thy friend. So he's actually warning against the danger of that and telling everyone that they need to be extremely careful in this area. And now he's going to talk about laziness. And as we've said, it's hard to find a subject in the book of Proverbs that's not discussed. And he's going to use the ant as an example. You believe how quick fire ants build. You can be there one day and there's nothing there, and you go back the next day and there's this mound of fire ants. Hate those things, don't you? And they sure don't feel good around your ankles. But they are very diligent. Ants are. And so he uses ants as an example of those that are not lazy. Give not sleep to thine eyes, nor slumber to thine eyelids. Deliver thyself as a roe from the hand of the hunter, and as a bird from the hand of the fowler. Go to the ant. Look at the ant. Look at his diligence. Look at his work ethics. Go to the ant, thou sluggard. Consider her ways and be wise, which having no guide, overseer, or ruler, provideth her meat in the summer, and gathereth her food in the harvest. So, what does the ant do? Makes preparation, works diligently to take care of her needs. So gathers her food, her meat in the summer, her food in the harvest, And he says, how long wilt thou sleep, O sluggard? When wilt thou arise out of thy sleep? Yet a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep, so shall thy poverty come as one that travaileth, and thy want as an armed man. I'm sure that all of us are concerned about the work ethics of our society. Have you noticed, just like I have, that whether you're going in a restaurant or whatever the business might be, that on the door as you go in, sign after sign that says help wanted? How many times have we heard recently by people that are in those positions that we cannot find people that are willing to work? It's everywhere now. We're at a time in our society where if a person is willing to work, they can find a job doing something. And also, Wes has been talking about this a lot because he's in employment and he can't find enough people to work at his place. But prices, the wage per hour is being elevated and is being elevated to somehow initiate people going to work. And people are even giving bonuses if you'll come to work for me. It's an amazing thing. It's a sad thing that we live in a lazy society where people had rather just draw some kind of check than use themselves to make a contribution to society through some work means. And it's really sad. Well, unfortunately, it's that way in a lot of places. And it's a tragic commentary on our society. And it's true that there are a lot of people in our society that are just too lazy to work. And again, that's one of the things that he's talking about. What about that? $2,000 signing bonus. There's a lot of, Wes, who was you telling me? Was it Chick-fil-A that was starting people at $15? Just working in. Yeah, and the car place in Huntsville's paying how much for those starting out? $17 to $23 an hour. Well, that's something really, isn't it? Just amazing, though, that with those jobs out there, you still have people that just don't want them because they're not willing to work. They're lazy. They just want to sit around and get by on whatever money that they can receive from the government. And so he talks about the results here. How long wilt thou sleep, O sluggard? When wilt thou arise out of thy sleep? Yet a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep. So shall thy poverty come as one that travaileth, and thy want as an armed man. And we know what the New Testament teaches. Paul said what? If a man will not work, neither shall he eat. Pretty strong language, right? Yeah, and unfortunately, that's what a lot of people do. A naughty person, we're out of time. A naughty person, a wicked man, walketh with a froward mouth. Let's stop right there and pick up. You can't say enough about our tongues, can you? Being careful with our mouths. And so we will pick up with verse 12 next Sunday morning of Proverbs chapter 6. And of course, when you get down to verse 16 and following, you're going to read of the 7 abominations. So we'll get there, Lord willing, next week.